Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, or buonasera. It's a pleasure to be with you. If you invite me back in the future, I'll try to do this in Italian, but I can't do it right now. I think I'll understand your questions in Italian, so unless you talk very quickly. So I'm thrilled to be here with you. And I'm going to talk about a wide range of things that have to do with the evolution of the global economy. But let me preface it by saying I tend to be an optimist at heart. There are many people who are anxious and afraid. There's much instability in various parts of the world, including here in Europe, big potential problems on the other side of the Atlantic as well. I think we're in some sense all in the same boat. But I think we'll figure it out. And I expect in 10 years we'll be in a very different situation with youth unemployment down, restoration of sustainable patterns of growth, and so on. But I want to say one other thing before I sort of launch into showing you some pictures and painting a picture. And that is, we will get to that end point 10 years from now if we are thoughtful, if we're humble and recognize that we're taking a journey that we've never taken before, that we're not ideological, that we try to be pragmatic. We know we're navigating with imperfect charts. Much of what I just said characterizes successful sort of policy formation in developing countries when they're trying to grow from very low levels of income. But now I think it applies to all of us. And so when I look at, the country that I'm a citizen of and see the politics gridlocked, with huge polarizing differences among people with a kind of static view of the world, I think this isn't going to work. That's not how you deal with change of this magnitude. We're going to have to live through it and learn and get better over time. So let me start out by saying a couple of things about what I've been doing, very briefly. I chaired a commission on growth and development, which was it's a commission that was populated with people unlike me, political and policy leaders in developing countries mostly. And I learned a great deal from them about developing country growth, and that was the reason I finally decided to write the book that I wrote. That's the English version. In parallel, I had been actually working in China, trying to bring international perspectives to the government on policy issues where they thought international experience in a wide range of countries would be relevant. And I've enjoyed that and learned a great deal about growth in that country. And more recently, I've been trying to understand some of the structural challenges in the advanced economies. And so what you'll hear in the next 40 minutes is a sort of snapshot of some of these things. And then I think what I ought to do is stop and let you take it where you want to go. I also wrote this little book, which was my PhD thesis. This is actually what got me the Nobel Prize. It's called Market Signaling. And I only put it up here because I recently went back to it. And one of the features of these kinds of structures with asymmetric information is that they have multiple equilibria. And I realized it was relevant to the world we live in. So if there's time, I'll talk briefly about that. What is the next convergence? Well, let me try to explain it briefly. It's basically a story of what's happened in the world that we live in from an economic point of view in the last 300 or 400 years. So if you go back before the British Industrial Revolution and look at Angus Madison's famous data, what you'll discover is countries are essentially the same. Most people are poor, and there isn't anything that looks like growth in the sense we mean it in the modern world. The Ming Dynasty, which was roughly 16th century, in China, they were a little better off than continental Europe. I mean, it's hard to imagine this now, but that's the world we live in. Then that pattern broke. In about 1750, with the British Industrial Revolution, it spilled over first into continental Europe, and then across the Atlantic into America and Canada, and eventually Australia and New Zealand. And that new pattern produced real growth, not breathtakingly fast, 1, 1.5%, 2%, 2.5% in continental Europe in real terms. But it went on for 200 years, up until the end of World War II, and actually continued after that. That included about 15% of the world's population. The other 85% stayed exactly the same as they were. So you had 200 years of what you could call divergence, in which the countries we now call developed or advanced, like this one, took off, you know, on what was then considered an economic rocket, and everybody else stayed the same. And at the end of that 200 years, you know, you had countries where the average per capita income was on the order of $15,000 in the advanced country group, and the per capita income in the other economies was like $300. You know, differences of, you know, on the order of times 50, 40, 50. Then that pattern broke. And so we're halfway through, a bit more, a century in which the other 85% joined the party, hence the term convergence. And we're at a very special point in that journey. You know, if you go back, and for those of you who are old enough like me to remember this, to the 60s and 70s, some of these countries had started to grow at very high rates, actually, for reasons that we probably won't have time to talk about tonight. But they were tiny. They didn't make any difference. Nobody paid any attention to them. The group of countries we call developing is about to pass 50% of the global economy. And from here on in, they are going to be, in aggregate, the dominant part of the global economy. The two future economic giants are China and India. They have 1.3 and 1.2 billion people each. You add them up, you have almost 40% of the world's population, and they're growing at 7, 8, and 9% a year. I mean, unbelievable speeds in terms of historical experience. So this is the process that will come to an end somewhere in the second half of the century we're in, but we're at that inflection point, and it has all kinds of consequences. This high growth will probably be sustained. It will cause the global economy to triple in size over the next 25 years. Many of you in this room, and I'm one of them, think that there's problems with the natural resource base of the planet that we share, with a global economy that runs at about $65 to $70 trillion. Well, imagine what you would think, or what you will think, when you realize that that global economy is going to be running at a run rate of something like $180 to $200 trillion. I mean, we have a major, major set of issues, some of which will be discussed in your later lectures, on having to do with sustainability in multiple dimensions. So there are lots of issues to be tackled here, but we have some very important issues right now. So I'm going to skip over this part and not talk about the developing countries. So but let me just put this up. This is a picture, a table of the global economy measured in economic terms, in what we call GDP. And these are the countries in the world, or in a couple of cases, regions. So the biggest economy in the world is the European Union. The second biggest is the United States. The third biggest is China. Now, you'll read in the newspaper it's the second biggest, because that's because people have decided not to count the European Union as an economic unit. But these are enormous. The countries with a yellow line through them are developing countries. Now, if you looked at this picture 15 years ago, there wouldn't be any yellow lines on it at all, right? At all. None of them appeared in this list. Then if you look at population, these are the populous countries in the world. China and India, that I mentioned before. And then you have Europe and the United States at 500 million and a little over 300 million. And then look at the rest. Or cast your eye toward the bottom. I wonder if this pointer works. Oh, cool. Excuse me. That's a California term. That means how nice. Among these countries, this is the total population, and the developing country part of it is 3.9 billion. The global population is somewhere between 6.5 and 7 billion right now. What I'm trying to say is these high-growth countries that are already big are on the way to being the dominant part of the global economy. And so we need to understand them. We need to understand that they're becoming more like us. And we need to be able to manage through a whole bunch of transitions that are associated with this much growth and this much shifting around of economic mass. So, for example, this is global energy consumption, put together by actually a think tank in Vienna that's done very good work. And you can see most of the increase in energy consumption over the next 100 years or so is going to be in the developing countries. Now, this isn't, we don't have time to get technical. Energy growth, consumption growth, is not as high as income growth, fortunately, or we probably wouldn't survive. This is a different take on it. So for most of the post-war period, if you looked at the global investment rates, that is how much of income every year is invested, the answer is, in the early post-war period, it was very high. Why? Because a number of economies were recovering from the war. So the investment rates required to produce that kind of recovery were relatively high. The developing countries were trying to figure out how to grow, and the ones that were growing were investing at astonishingly high rates, like 30 and 40% of their GDP, their national income. They're not quite the same, but it's close. But they were so small, it didn't matter. Then the investment rates started to drop because the war recovery was over, and they dropped and dropped and dropped up to about now. Now, this is a McKinsey Global Institute study, and their forecast is that this is about to reverse, and we're going to go back up the way we came. Why? Because there's about hundreds and hundreds of millions of people who are getting richer, who are becoming middle class in these developing countries. They're going to build city after city after city. In China, about 16 million people move to urban areas every year as the population of the rural areas goes away and people shift into the modern economy. 16 million people. The way I describe that when I'm in America is they have to build Los Angeles every year to accommodate this flow. That is a massive amount of infrastructure, not to mention production facilities and jobs and commercial facilities and so on that have to get built. So the conclusion is there's an investment boom coming. Now, let me just pause briefly on this. We have lived in a world of declining investment and a mass of savings flooding the thing. That's one of the reasons we've lived in this low interest rate environment. It's one of the reasons we have reasonably sloppy fiscal behavior almost everywhere in the developed world. Not everywhere, but almost everywhere. And this is about to reverse. So here we are, with the developing countries having reversed this trend because their weight's big enough to reverse it now, right? And an investment boom coming at us, and where are we positioned? We have in some cases, excess personal debt, not here in Italy. In some cases, we have excess public debt, yes, here in Italy. And we have aging populations. Let me give you the extreme case, Japan. Japan has a public debt to GDP ratio of 220%. That's 100% higher than Italy's. It has a population that's getting so old so fast, and there's no immigration to speak of into Japan, that the population is shrinking. And we're about to face an investment boom that may very well drive the interest rates up. That is, in economic terms, your worst nightmare, right? You're about to get the costs of debt in all categories raised, and you have built up the public debt and shifted it over to a generation that has to pay for it, lousy intertemporal choice, and that generation's shrinking in size. But versions of that are characteristic of many of our countries in the developed country world. And so one of the things we're going to have to figure out, and are trying to figure out, is how to get out of this mess. If I'm leaving you with the message that while there's a special problem in Italy and the south of Europe and in Spain, and in the Eurozone generally, that's true, but much of it is much more general than that. It's adapting to a sort of structurally changing world. Now this has stopped working. Well, have I said anything interesting so far? Oh, help. Okay, here we go. I'll comment on this briefly. If you asked the question even 10 years ago, if you had a slowdown of the magnitude that we've had in Europe and America, the core of the developed world, and then asked the question, what would happen to the growth of these high-growth developing countries like China, India, and Brazil, and so on? The answer would be their growth would tank. That is completely dependent on us. If you ask that question now, and actually look at the post-crisis performance, they took a bit of a dip, and then they just bounced right back up. So they are, to use the term of art that we use these days, they're partially decoupled. Now the truth is, meaning if we go flat, very little growth, they can sustain the growth. Why? Because they're richer, they trade with each other, and their economic mass is big enough to pull this off. They can generate enough of the right kind of demand to support the growth. But that's about the limit of the decoupling. If you take Europe down, which seems to be the trajectory we're on now, and that helps take America down, which I think will happen later this year, we'll probably have a recession across the Atlantic as well, they won't be able to withstand that. That'll slow them down. So if you want to score the extent of decoupling, think of it as we go flat, they're okay. We go down, we start to take them down with us. Now, and you can see this here. In the recent past, these are the developing countries' growth rates. They did take a dip, but they really bounced back. And so this, you can just see the start of the breaking away from us. Now, here's something worrying, and then I'm going to talk about the European situation and what's going on in Italy. Oops. This is a picture of the government debt to GDP ratios in a range of countries. The ones down here are developing countries, and even the low-income countries, this little line here, they're trending down to 40% debt to GDP, public debt to GDP. The advanced countries, with virtually no exceptions, are trending up toward 100%. Now, I don't think most people, at least most people who are economists, thought they'd ever see this. But this is not a good trend. The Reinhart-Rogoff work says somewhere around 90%, you start to run risks. I mean, you would have used Italy as a counterexample up until last spring or the summer when the yields started to rise. But we've been just running up public debt. It's a perfect storm. It's a massive failure of countercyclicality. Let me take Italy in particular. I have friends on the other side of the Atlantic that said, Italy grew even more slowly in the post-crisis period than others. Well, that was actually a good decision. Italy had a debt to GDP ratio of 120%, maybe 110 at the start. So having a countercyclical fiscal response was a non-starter here. And so the previous Minister of Finance and Economy, Giulio Tremonti, did the right thing. He sat on the deficit to prevent the debt to GDP ratio from running up even more, and hence the tough growth performance. A lot of the buildup of liabilities in these economies occurred on what I've used the term here, autopilot. What this means is they occur automatically because you're having a deep economic downward dip. What happens in a big economic downward dip? Tax revenues drop, social safety net payments rise, right? The deficit balloons. You actually have to intervene to stop that counter-cyclical response from occurring by changing programs. And finally, we have demographic headwinds. Bob Mundell comments on this. This is the euro-dollar exchange rate. This is the two most important currencies in the world, right? And they're bouncing around, you know, valued against each other, you know, like the markets had schizophrenia. Money's rushing back and forth across the Atlantic as investors decide which side is more risky this week and not. I mean, this is nuts. Now, what Bob wants, and not most economists agree, but he's, you know, a thoughtful and insightful man, is he thinks these exchange rates should be managed, that this is just way too much, you know, self-induced risk to put into an economy that requires investment, including cross-border investments. Here are these are, forgive me, but I wanted you to see a bimodal distribution, right? So when investors sort of look at a situation like the one we have now in Europe, they say, well, there's two scenarios. I think this is pretty good analysis. One scenario is the reforms in Italy and Spain work. The ECB and the Germans, even though they won't say it, actually intervene when the yields go up too much and start to change the incentive structure of the game. And the longer-term institutional reform actually works, meaning there's some form of fiscal discipline and or centralization. One day, and that's one scenario. The other one is the yields run up, nobody does anything about it. At some point, Greece and Portugal decide to exit because they really can't solve the problem without resetting the terms of trade. And Italian citizens say, well, we just went through all of this austerity and reform, and the yield went up to 9% and stayed there. It hasn't done that yet. That undid all the austerity we had. You know, maybe this isn't really a good game to play. That leads to the unwinding of the Eurozone. So that's the bad scenario. When you put those two together and then ask what are people thinking, what they're thinking is one day they think the probability of the good one's high, and the next day they think it's not so high. And so when you actually turn that into a distribution of returns, what they think of, you know, as the returns on various assets, like sovereign debt in Italy, like sovereign debt in Greece, like the euro itself, you get a bimodal distribution. I mean, it's extraordinary. If you plot these things for a lot, this happens to come from Deutsche Bank analysis. You see things that you don't normally see and that don't appear in finance market theory very much. And it's a reflection of the macro risk that's inherent in the global economy and the global financial system now. The Eurozone. Okay, I'm just going to go out on a limb and tell you what I think is going to happen. And then you could ask me questions and see if you think I'm nuts. I think the most likely scenario is that the core Eurozone actually holds together. And in order for that to happen, a number of things have to happen. When I say core Eurozone, I believe that Greece and Portugal cannot solve the problem of growth and employment for the young people without exiting the euro. So I'm in that camp. There are people who disagree with that. I don't expect you to believe me. But when I go around and ask thoughtful people all around this continent, well, you know, where is the future for Greece, you know, without the exchange rate mechanism to reset the terms of trade, given that they're at least 40% out of bounds in terms of productivity in relation to incomes? Nobody has an answer. So I draw the logical conclusion, which is they probably have to exit. I told the journalist just before I came up here, and I'm going to tell you, I was in the supermarket talking to a guy this morning in Milan, talking to a guy that, you know, every once in a while asks me an economic question. And this morning he said, siamo vicino alla Grecia. And I said, no, not even close. Non siamo vicino alla Grecia. Italy is in a very, very different situation. So the reason I'm optimistic about the Eurozone core is that I think Italy actually will solve this set of problems. It's not going to be fun and it's not going to be easy, but I think it's doable. So let me try to explain why. This is a picture of the aggregate debt for a number of countries. You can see that the two big outliers in aggregate debt are Japan and the United Kingdom. So it may not be surprising that the United Kingdom is trying to batten down the hatches under the Cameron administration. And then you have a set of countries, Spain's a bit high, and then you've got a whole bunch of countries like Italia, Switzerland, the United States, all in this range in terms of aggregate debt. Conclusion, this country is not out of line in terms of aggregate debt. The problem is the composition. So the black stuff up here is public debt. The little gray area is household debt. So a sort of simple description of the Italian situation is the government debt's too big and the household debt's small. And the rest of it's kind of normal. Italians don't borrow. They have high net worth because they save a lot. The household sector is very healthy. And actually, the country's balance sheet, consolidated, is very healthy. The problem is here. Italy has the second highest public debt ratio in the world next to Japan, which, by the way, is considerably higher than that. I mean, a question that somebody may want to ask later is, why isn't Japan blowing up already, given that ratio? And there are answers to that. I'm not sure they're convincing. But here's Italy with very high public sector debt. And Italy is a major economy. So this is the third largest sovereign debt market in the world right now. And the reason everybody says that things have to go well here is because you can't have the world's third largest sovereign debt market tank and expect the Eurozone to hold together. It just won't. It will unwind the Eurozone. So it has to happen. I think there's somebody down there, and they're not. I showed you a picture of public debt. The other thing that's a bit worrying is that the advanced countries have accumulated non-debt liabilities. Pensions here would be the biggest one. In America, it would be medical care-related liabilities. These are things that you're going to have to pay for in the future if you don't change the system. All I want you to realize when you look at this graph is that compared with the public debt levels, these are huge. Now, they're not quite as dangerous because you can change them by dialing the parameters of the programs that create these liabilities, but you have to dial the parameters. If you just say, well, we can wait, and you wait and wait and wait, eventually the financial markets will sort of turn and say they're not going to do anything. And then all hell breaks loose in terms of stability and interest rates and so on. The real strengths in Italy are, I think, there's lots of problems to be solved. The tax evasion problem is necessary. The pension reform is necessary. The removing elements of rigidity in the labor markets, as was the case in Germany, is important. And the growth-oriented investments are important. The country has the resources to do it. The North here is an extremely dynamic and largely competitive economy. I think if you wanted to understand what program with suitable adjustments for the difference in the countries works, you'd probably go look at the German one, and I'll come to that later. But the bottom line, I use the following framework in thinking about these things. One, does the country have the resources, meaning balance sheet, policy instruments to deal with the problem? That's test one. Greece fails that test. Italy doesn't. Two, do they know what they're doing? Is the government competent? Right? Italy clearly passes that test, and I'll refrain from commenting on that issue before the technical government took over. And the third test is will. Almost all the problems that we have are questions, and uncertainty in the markets, are questions about whether we have the political will to do what we need to do. So if you go around this country, say a year ago, and say, do we have a huge problem in a survey, most people would say, I'm not sure, or not really. If you go around now, people are scared. Everybody knows there's a problem and we can't stay on the course we were on. But that doesn't create the political will, because embedded in any resetting of the structure and trajectory of an economy is a set of distributional issues. resetting an economy's direction requires somebody pays for it. And there are lots of disagreements. They're distributional issues, okay? And so when you see things stall, you know, and worry that they're not going to get done, it's not because there's really any uncertainty about what needs to be done, plus or minus a bit. It's a question of what's a fair way to divide up the burden. And this problem appears over and over again. You know, nobody misunderstands, you know, what needs to happen in the Eurozone to make things stable. The issue is, are the Germans going to pay for it all? What fraction of it for it will be paid by Greek citizens through austerity and other things? It's sometimes called the burden sharing problem. And if I leave you with nothing else, I want to leave you with the notion we all have restructuring things to go through like this, with variance across countries, and we'll all have the same problem, which we'll agree that we need to do something different. We'll agree that the old growth model isn't working and that we have to go through fiscal rebalancing, but that doesn't mean we'll do anything, because we may lock up, because we can't get agreement on what's a fair way to distribute the burden. And that, by the way, is probably where the market's uncertainty about Italy lies now. It doesn't think that Italy can't right the ship. It doesn't think that the government doesn't know what it's doing. The uncertainty is whether the political system will be able to actually make these choices with the distributional issues embedded in them. And when the markets become uncertain, and they are, okay, even though the yields came down for a while and have now started back up on the 10-year bond, that's not private capital flowing in net at all. That's the LTRO from the central bank, the European Central Bank, that caused the yield decline largely, and it spilled over into the sovereign debt market. So we haven't, from the market point of view, we haven't rounded that corner yet. They're not sure that this is all going to get done. And when you can be sure that you've turned the corner, at least from the market perspective, is when the capital starts flowing in and the yields come down, not because of a policy action in Frankfurt or Brussels, but because the private capital, external private capital, is flowing back in. Now let me switch and show you a bit about the United States to illustrate the kinds of structural problems we face. So here is a picture of the last few recessions that we had in America in terms of the gross domestic product. We're clearly recovering. The blue in all of these graphs is the current one. So we're just clearly having a very slow recovery. This is a picture of gross private domestic investment. It hasn't got anywhere near back to where it was when we started the downturn. Why? Because we're short of domestic demand. And there's no reason to invest if there's no demand to invest against. This is a picture of employment. Okay? I'm sorry, I switched colors on you. I meant to switch this graph so it was blue. This is the employment situation. So this is the thing that really has everybody worried. This has actually come down and stayed down. And this, if we had this data for a bunch of countries, you wouldn't want me to flip through it. But employment is actually diverging from growth. This is a picture of the income distribution, again in the United States. And this picture is more dramatic than it is in most other advanced countries. The blue line, for example, this one is the median, the 50th percentile. Over a very long period of time, you have to admit that's pretty modest growth in real incomes. This line up here is the 80th percentile. So you have to get up to about 75 or 80% in the American income distribution before you start to see real growth. So there's a long-term income distribution problem that we don't completely understand. So let me talk about employment. So the United States economy, I decided after the crisis and everybody started talking about the cyclical recovery we were going to have, I thought, this is crazy. but we've got structural problems. And then I realized I didn't really know how to describe the structural problems, so I thought I'd better go find out what happened to the structure of the American economy. So with a co-author, a young South African woman named Sandile Helachwayo, we went and got the data, industry by industry in the United States, you know, over an 18-year period coming into the crisis in 2008, and we asked, where did this economy create employment? That is, in which industries, and how would we characterize it? And where did it create growth? Value added is the measure economists use, because if you add it up properly, it ends up being the GDP of the country. Now, the other thing I need to describe to you, and I apologize, but this is a little technical. Most of you are used to thinking of exports and imports, you know, as kind of the thing that gets traded in the global economy. We divided the American economy as best we could into a tradable side and a non-tradable side. Tradable means goods and services that in principle can trade internationally. It doesn't mean they trade, it means they could trade, right? So Apple products can trade, but Americans buy a lot of Apple products, so they don't trade. That portion doesn't trade. Do you see the difference? The non-tradable part, which is huge, is stuff that can't trade. It's government, healthcare, construction. I mean, it's about 70% of most advanced economies. So we divided, as best we could, the American economy into a tradable and a non-tradable part. And what we found is that the American economy generated virtually all its employment increase, which was 27.3 million jobs, in the non-tradable sector. Now, when we said this about a year and a half ago, people were shocked. Because this is the part of the economy where you don't have to compete with anybody else. All right? By definition, it's locked up. It's yours. If you look at value added, meaning what each industry adds, the only difference between value added and output is you subtract off the things they purchase. So if you have to buy a lot of energy to make steel or aluminum, you don't count the energy, right? Somebody else sells it to you. So the value added is the part that you really create. So value added is quite different. Actually, the tradable part and the non-tradable part grew, both grew. And then if you look at value added per person, or the per job, or per person employed, in these two sides of the economy, what you discover is this. First of all, there's clearly a kink. Something dramatic happened around 2000. But basically, the part of the economy that wasn't generating employment, net, was generating a whole lot of increase in value added per person because it was generating value added and there were no new people working there. I mean, there was lots of churn, but net. Meanwhile, the non-tradable part, this red line, basically used up the value added by employing more people. Value added per person is pretty closely correlated with incomes. So let me translate what I just said. This part of the economy, called non-tradable, employed most of the people and didn't really experience much income growth. And this part of the economy, which is the part that sort of plays in the global economy sandbox, generated a huge amount of income growth and not much employment. What's really going on here, if you look underneath this, is that highly educated people who work in things like finance, computer design, some of the industries you have here in the northeast of Italy, some of the German advanced manufacturing sectors, these are doing fine. They're competing successfully in the global economy. The global economy is growing, even if our part isn't growing very well. And they think it's terrific. The middle income people have several hundred million new competitors who just joined, and labor-saving technology, particularly information technology. And basically, at least on the tradable side, they're not finding the opportunities are expanding. In fact, they're declining. And so they go cross the boundary and go to the non-tradable side and find employment and keep the incomes down because there's so many of them competing for the jobs. If you can't read this, but I'll leave it behind. This is every single industrial sector, including services in the American economy, The blue lines are the increases on the tradable side or decreases, and the red lines are the big increases. And so I'll just spend 1 minute on this. So computer design, management, science kind of stuff, managing multinational enterprises, finance grew quite nicely, and these are the manufacturing industries. They all declined. They didn't decline because the industry vanished. They declined because the parts of the value-added chain that were made sensible were sort of put somewhere else, and there was technological change, increased efficiency as well. Now look at the red lines. Construction. Well, we had a bit of a construction bubble here, just like Spain. So that isn't there anymore. What's this one? Healthcare. I mean, you probably all know we spend 16 or 17% of GDP on healthcare. This one's government. Now, government's not in very good shape. So when you stare at this for a minute, you realize that these growth engines were dependent on either government or deficits or a leveraged asset bubble and excess consumption and a bunch of things. And so those growth engines probably aren't going to work. So when I say we have a structural problem, I'm talking to a young man at Bocconi, and we're trying to see if we can get the same data for the Italian economy. It won't look exactly the same because the American is extreme. Now I will show you what the Germans managed to do about 7 or 8 years ago when they were doing reforms. When you read the newspapers now, what you hear is that Germany is a sort of powerhouse, and they don't realize that they're benefiting from an undervalued exchange rate. What you don't hear is that Germany was the sick country in Europe in the year 2000. And they had a huge unemployment problem, productivity problem, competitiveness problem, which is why the reforms under Chancellor Schroeder were undertaken. And they were very hard. It cost him his job. But what they produced is a very different pattern than what you see. So on the employment side, this is the German case, and that's the American case. The tradable sector did not lose its employment generating capacity. If you go to value added, it's not that different, but the German value added in the tradable sector was more substantial relative to the non-tradable and on the American side. And then if you look at the value added per person, which is correlated with incomes, you see a completely different picture. That is, in Germany, there isn't a sort of global elite that's having fun. In the global economies, the incomes are sort of going through the roof. Something's overriding it. Now, economics isn't very good at explaining what's overriding it, but something is. Because these are both advanced economies with similar technological and global forces operating on them. Now, we don't have time to talk about what the reforms are on this occasion, but they're important. And they're not totally dissimilar from what's being attempted here on the Italian side of the house. I'll skip over this, but the United States is unique in running a current account. Think of that as trade. It's not quite the same thing. Deficit with respect to everybody. It's very hard to find a country that runs a deficit with respect to every other country that's of any significance, but the United States does it. And one of the reasons for this, we believe, although it's very difficult to prove, is the United States is still a major reserve currency, which means there's capital inflows that don't occur in other countries. And so an adjustment mechanism. This is sometimes called by international macroeconomists as the exorbitant privilege. I call it the exorbitant dubious privilege of having the ability to run a current account deficit and have capital make up the difference for a long period of time. Now, one of the consequences of that is that the Chinese central bank holds about $3.4 trillion of reserves, of which the majority are American-denominated short-term bonds or European short-term bonds. Now, that's not good for the Chinese economy either, and they're trying to undo that, but it's an asset management headache. I'll skip this. All I wanted to tell you is that the income distributions in these various countries are extraordinarily different. And the reason it's worth staring at something like this is that this is one of the dimensions that contributes or doesn't contribute to social cohesion. And social cohesion has something to do with the ability to govern yourself. So in America, we don't use the European term social cohesion. We call it the social contract. So the social contract in America used to be, compared to Europe, you're kind of on your own. It's less protective. But if you work hard, then there's lots of opportunity, and you can really do quite well. That's a great social contract as long as the second part's true. But if there's a significant chunk of the population for which it isn't true anymore, then you have to rebuild the social contract. Now, what you see here is very different results in different countries. So let me take the two ones I was just talking about. If you look at Germany, this is the column I like best. This is the income of the top 20% of the income distribution, the average income of that group, divided by the average income of the bottom 20%. So the bottom 20% is more than just poor people, and the top 20% is more than the 1% who are probably rich because they deserve to be rich, right? That ratio in Germany is 4.3. In the United States, it's 8.4. The difference is larger than a factor of 2 times. Now, at 4.3, you're probably sharing the pain of adjustment fairly well. At 8.3, it looks like you're ignoring the fact that one side's losing and the other side's gaining. Again, these are the PISA tests from the OECD. You can't see it, but what they show is that a wide range of developed countries are slipping in terms of educational performance. You know, in the developing countries, where education is a crucial element of the growth strategy, they got in the habit of measuring education by how much money they spent on it or how many kids were enrolled. And somebody came along and tested the kids and found out nothing was happening. So there are people who go around surveying kids in northern India, you know, with little cards that, you know, the card says, I'm a boy or I'm a girl in Hindi, and they can't read it. And they're in grade 5. So somebody finally said, maybe we ought to measure the cognitive skills that kids actually come out of school with and see how we're doing. And the results, in many places, were appalling on a very broad front around the global economy. Not just in America, where we have a big problem, not just in the developing countries. And so these PISA tests, I think, have become quite important guides to where one needs to focus on the human capital front. In addition, and I'll kind of wind up this section with this, this is a picture for the OECD countries, think of them as the high-income countries, of the fraction of national income that goes to labor, to people who work, as opposed to the people who own the capital or the government. That's the other two places that income can go to. At least I think that's right. I can't think of any other place. Maybe you could burn it. And what you see, this is notoriously difficult data to collect because of all kinds of adjustments you have to make for fringe benefits and all kinds of stuff. But basically, labor did very well up until about 1970 and has been declining as a fraction since. I apologize, you can't read the bottom of this very well. And that's not surprising. About 1970, or not much long after that, the global economy, in the sense of developing countries, started to get big. And now we're, you know, having all of these people, you know, who were completely disconnected from the advanced economies in the global economy are now entering the global economy, and they're moving up the value-added chain and competing at different levels of the income, labor, sort of training skill spectrum. And this it's a moving target. They'll keep moving up. So who they're competing with now will be different in 10 years. I'm probably going to run out of time, so I'll just tell you a little bit about what's going on in China and then shut up. China is entering what is known as the middle income transition. And it's incredibly important that this go well. People think of China as a competitor, but it's not. It's a growth engine. It doesn't mainly compete with us. It has taken certain chunks of the value-added chain, and it's understandable that people think in those terms. but it's not a zero-sum game. China is the major export market for India, Brazil, 2 of the other BRICS, Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Australia, and a very long list of countries. Not the United States, not Germany, not anything, just China. And it's the main growth engine in the global economy. We're going down in Europe, and we're likely to go at least flat or maybe down on the American side. And these are the big chunks of the global economy. They're entering what is called the middle income transition. What is this? Well, you know, if you know anything about the history of a country like Korea, which has been through this before, Korea is now an OECD country with the low end of a high-income country per capita income. In the 1980s, Korea was a high-quality, low-cost manufacturing place. You know, if you were wearing shirts that were made abroad or athletic shoes made by Nike, they would have been made in Korea. But the wages and incomes were rising, and so that all went away. In fact, it went from Korea and Taiwan into China, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And this cascading is going to go on. Well, China's about to do the same thing. China's been in the labor-intensive, process-oriented, assembly-type manufacturing business, and they're so large they actually drove the prices of that kind of stuff down. But they're going to exit because the incomes are high enough now that they can't be the place that has a comparative advantage in that anymore. And they know this, right? They're not confused. They've studied Korea and so on. And so they're about to exit. What is going to happen to all those jobs? And how many are there? There's somewhere between 85 million and 100 million jobs in that category that are going to leave China and go somewhere in the developing world. It's an enormous opportunity for countries that are at earlier stages of growth. But China has to generate a completely different industrial structure that has higher value added. If you want to think of it in these terms, they've got to look a little bit more like us. And in order to do that, they have to let the market run the show and the state get smaller. They've got to get consumer and household incomes up so it can drive the economy and a lot of other things. Most economies that enter the middle income transition in the post-war period at high speed slow down. Brazil was a high-speed growth economy from 1950 to 1975. More than 7% a year. I mean, really high. And then stopped for almost a quarter of a century. Literally stopped. Most of the countries that we found in the Growth Commission work that were high growth, there's only 5 exceptions. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and the 2 city-states, Hong Kong and Singapore. These are the countries that didn't experience a major growth slowdown. So if you look at this statistically, the odds aren't in China's favor, right? This is not a no-brainer by any means. But nobody's tried it at China's scale. That's the bad news. And second, they're pretty good at what they do. And people have been betting against China for a long time. And most of those bets since the reforms in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping took over have been very bad bets. So I'm not sure you'd want to bet against them now. It involves huge structural changes, moving up the value-added chain, getting rid of the labor-intensive stuff, increased reliance on domestic demand and less on exports. And finally, this has been an investment-led economy. It's an economy that invests at approximately 45% of GDP. That's almost half, right? Half the Chinese economy is reinvested and not consumed in any given year. That's a complete outlier. We have never seen that before. But some of that investment is becoming inefficient. And they keep doing it because that's the model they know, the investment-led model. And so the reformers in China know they've got to stop this. And they have major system reforms in order to accomplish it. I don't have time to go through all this. This is disposable income. The Chinese household sector, not unlike many of the rest of us, is experiencing rising incomes but declining as a fraction of the total from 70 to 60%. When you combine that with the savings rate in the household sector, which is 30%, you discover that consumption is like 40% of GDP. Now, in an advanced country like this one, it'll be between 65 and 70%. So it's all very well to cheerfully say we're going to derive growth in terms of both magnitude and composition by what the consumers want. But the consumers are only consuming 40% of the GDP, right? The rest of it's investment or something, government. And so this pattern has to reverse in China. And this actually is one of their major challenges, is to reverse that. They're getting a little help from the markets. A year and a half ago, in the coastal areas, particularly in the Pearl River Delta, the wage rate started to rise for the first time at 20 to 30% a year. So they're getting a big boost. I mean, it's scaring the wits out of the businesses there because it's compressing margins pretty fast. But it's actually what they need to implement this transition. This is a Chinese current account surplus. So basically what happened here, this is a subject of great controversy, particularly between the European Union and China and the United States, with us saying, you know, they're manipulating their currency, they're mercantilists. Actually, what happened in China is a little different than what you get from reading the newspapers. They didn't run big surpluses for the most part up until about 2005, and then they started to rise. In 2005, the multi-fiber agreement, which was the international agreement that distributed the apparel industry around the world, went away. It just lapsed and wasn't renewed. And the apparel industry concentrated globally very fast in a small number of countries, including China and Bangladesh. And then China's very high productivity growth caused this. This, I can assure you, wasn't something they were pleased with. This was an extremely nasty surprise in China to run a current account surplus of 10.6%. And it produced howls of rage from the advanced countries. It's coming down now, and I think you will see a return to something like a more normal pattern later on. What is the major risk in China? Or risks? Well, if you ask them that question, they would say the major risk is Europe, meaning external, right? But if you then get turned around and say, well, what are the major internal risks? There's only 2 or 3 of them, because they understand what the moving parts are, and they are very pragmatic about trying to get it done. One risk is social upheaval because of what they call rising social tensions. The income inequality is rising, and there's quite a lot of local corruption and other things that make people quite angry. There are about 90,000 violent demonstrations a year, most of which you do not hear about. And so it could blow up on just social unrest taking increasingly violent forms. The second one is vested interests. Now, if you've been reading about Bo Xilai and some Englishmen getting murdered and gotten lost in that story, you wouldn't be alone. We're all lost. But I've asked friends in China, is this really a pitched battle between the people who want to turn the clock back for ideological reasons, you know, toward the era when the state was dominant in the economy, really had control, against the reformers? And they say no. It's dressed up to sound like that. This is a battle among vested interests. And the biggest vested interest in the Chinese economy is the state-owned enterprise sector. It's just a word, I think, to many of you. The state-owned enterprises are the main enterprises in 9 strategic sectors in China, including finance, aerospace, and a bunch of others, telecommunications, electricity, etc. They own more than half the net fixed assets in the economy, and they account for at least 1/3 of the profits. And surrounding those enterprises on the management side and in the government are a whole lot of people who want to keep it that way. And that's inconsistent with having the market drive the economy and have it become more innovative and generate more value that way. So the reformers in China know that they have to win the battle against that and a few other vested interests. Or the vested interests will sort of surround themselves with clothing that looks like equity, failed, models on the Western side, including here in Italy and in America, and about any other argument you can think of that looks like, their different model is the right one, whereas in fact, they have to evolve the same way everybody else did. And that's the battle that's going on right now. And it's made complicated by the fact that it's in the middle of a leadership transition. We have a lot of leadership transitions around the world. We have an election in France on Monday. We have an election in America in November. And we have the Chinese leadership transition, if it sticks, sometime in the fall of this year. So, for the most part, the markets reflect optimism about China, and the growth seems to be holding up. But in a sense, there's another scenario. And it wouldn't take very much to cause people to raise their probabilities attached to the more negative scenario, meaning a failure of reform momentum. So in some sense, we've all got the same problem, right? We all have to change continuously in a way that's adaptive, and we're all struggling with how to do that in slightly different ways and in different circumstances. There are warning signs on the Chinese side of blocking access to the market. This is just one example that I picked off in the last couple of days. But the chairman and CEO of GE, General Electric, what used to be General Electric, Jeff Immelt, basically made a speech in which he said not quite GE's giving up on China, but a sort of warning shot. We're focusing on energy. We're going to focus on Australia and Canada and Brazil and a few other places that are natural resource rich. And we're not giving up on China, but we're sort of fed up with these 50-50 joint ventures. We're fed up with transferring technology and having market access blocked. Sometimes our partners among the state-owned enterprises seem a little bit more like competitors. What this is the early signs of a real problem if they don't get on top of it. Because, if you take the GEs and the Fiats and the IBMs and the Microsofts and a bunch of other people out of China, you'll still have a bunch of people trying to assemble things, but China won't be the natural place to do that. They need these other enterprises as part of the mix. So I'm almost done here, and I've probably talked too long. We are having, I'll close with this. We are having a discussion in a number of places in the world about the role of the state. And we should have a discussion about the role of the state. Some of it's ideological, as in America. Some people want a state that is as small as possible, consistent with sort of just functioning day-to-day, regulating the system and so on. Other people want a very large state that's very protective. And most people in the sort of middle want a state that's sort of pragmatic and adaptable and sort of solves problems, as they evolve and as the global economy shifts around us. In the Chinese side, I've just told you, they're misusing our troubles to argue for a big state. But the one thing I will say is this. Whatever role you think the state ought to have, it's got to have the resources to do it. And so if you're a business person, you're used to thinking of balance sheets and income statements. So ask yourself the question, what is the balance sheet of the average developed economy/democracy look like? Well, there's a fair amount of public debt, and there's a whole lot of, non-debt liabilities. So that looks pretty bad. What's the asset side look like? Ever thought about it? What does the asset side of the Italian balance sheet look like? Ownership in a few enterprises? If you were a business and discovered you couldn't find anything on the asset side of the balance sheet, what would you do? you give up on it. We don't have any assets. You know what the asset side of the balance sheet is for a country that has high debts and high non-debt liabilities? The asset is the presumed ability to tax our children and grandchildren. And that's irresponsible. And we got to stop doing this, or we won't have sustainable patterns of growth. We won't wrestle with these adaptive processes that I've talked about, and we won't solve the sustainability problems associated with a global economy that needs a new growth model. So I hope we succeed here in Italy, and I hope we succeed in a number of other places, because this path is really not going to work in the future. Thanks for coming and listening to me. I might understand the question, but I might not.
Okay. Dunque, il momento delle domande. Professore, può ascoltare anche in italiano perché... Sì, no, it's ok. Perché ovviamente capisce l'italiano. Allora, abbiamo due domande che arrivano dal web. Le faccio la prima. Professore, possibile che si senta parlare sempre e comunque di crescita? Persino crescita negativa in caso di calo, ma sempre crescita deve essere. In natura ogni soggetto, vivente o non vivente, nasce, cresce, muore. L'economia è una scienza creata dall'uomo, ma non può astrarsi dalla natura. Ha trovato il canale? It's okay? L'economia è una scienza creata dall'uomo, ma non può astrarsi dalla natura nella quale è inserita e della quale adopera le risorse. E le risorse sono limitate, come tutti sappiamo. Perché la crescita dovrebbe essere illimitata? Perché non parliamo realisticamente di decrescita? Questa domanda ci arriva dal web, da Andrea.
Okay. You all heard the question. So, first of all, in the advanced countries, there are a number of things that are going on that are consistent with what the questioner had in mind. Measurement systems are starting to adapt and not be just focused on income and consumption. The awareness of the dimensions of the sustainability problems is slowly rising. It's still not true if you go out and give people a quiz on the dimensions of the climate change problem, they'll be able to answer the question quantitatively, but they're starting to understand that there's a serious question, and they're starting to understand that the developing countries are going to be a massive addition to the party, you know, once they complete this growth cycle. And that's all good. I mean, the sustainability issues are important. Now, all I want to do to add to that is when you look at this, you have to look at it through somebody's eyes. If you look at it through a European's eyes, living in a country where you can afford to go have coffee and a nice meal and pasta and maybe enough consumption is enough, you'll see one thing. If you go to rural India and ask them, how do you feel about no more growth? You'll get a different answer. Now, it's not that one's right and one's wrong. It's context specific. If you then translate that into more macroeconomic terms, solving the sustainability problem by telling the 85% of the world that lives in the developing countries, approximately 5.5 billion people, that we really can't afford their growth, is not going to work as a global strategy. It just won't. All right? They'll say no, and they may not get as much help as they hope for from us. And so the way to think about it is they're going to grow. And they and we have a common interest in inventing growth models that are consistent with the natural resource base that we have. That's where our interests converge. And we're not doing very well yet at recognizing that common interest and then implementing it, but we are making some progress. The climate change discussions have faltered mainly because they got the problem definition wrong. I mean, nobody in their right mind, especially in a developing country, would commit to a 50-year target in terms of CO2 emissions, given what we know. I mean, you'd have to be nuts. If you were the Prime Minister of India and committed to a target now, given what we know and don't know about the cost of getting there, you'd be out of office in the next week, right? So the right discussion, if you have a long, complicated learning problem to conduct on a multinational basis, is then you figure out with your friends on the planet, how are we going to go and figure out how to do this? How are we going to start learning? How are we going to start generating new technology? What can we do now? I mean, how many people in this room know what the biggest target is with respect to increasing energy efficiency? Well, we could start by deepening the knowledge base. I'm not being critical of you. It turns out it's the energy efficiency of structures. There's a massive saving of energy efficiency over a 20 to 25-year period from just changing structures. Now, that doesn't mean that electric cars and green energy sources and other things are uninteresting parts of the mix. So I think one of the things that's going to happen is first those long-term target setting exercises will fail, and then cities, towns, developing countries, everybody will kind of get in the game and start doing their thing. And it's already starting to happen. And then we'll kind of go along in parallel thinking, we're not making much progress when we are, and we'll invent a new growth model. I'll tell you one last thing about this, because it's an important subject. It's not going to get the attention it deserves, while we have as much instability as we are dealing with now in the advanced countries, but it will, because we'll recover from this, and then we'll start to focus on whether our children and grandchildren are going to actually live in a world with a functioning, sustainable economic model. But in China now, what you and I think of as a global issue, like energy security or access or climate change or other dimensions of the environment, in China is a long-term growth strategy issue. Why? Because they know India is following along behind, and that's where most of the growth is going to be, and they can stop themselves. Okay? They don't need us to goof off and not pay attention. All they've got to do is try to use the old growth model and scale it up to a China and India level, and it'll fail. For sure, it'll fail. It'll fail on water, it'll fail on energy availability and price, it'll fail on climate change and carbon, it'll fail in multiple dimensions. And they know it. So they're already, in the 12th five-year plan, starting to try to figure out what the new growth model is, with aggressive energy technology investments, with education of the public, with... How many of you went to the Shanghai World Expo? The whole theme of that was sort of changing the growth model and having a green economy. Why? To sell China to foreigners? You know what fraction of the visitors to the Shanghai Expo were foreign? 3%. 97% of the several million people that went through there were Chinese. They were educating their own people about something they know very little about in order to build a foundation for launching themselves on a 25, 30, or 40-year journey that we're all going to take together, frankly, in order to solve this problem. Whether we get the job done, I don't know. If we don't, then as many environmentalists who are knowledgeable about economic things say, we'll either get the job done by working hard at it, or we'll get the job done of slowing growth down by having it happen to us, because the resource base won't hold up. I tried to talk about a little bit about this in the book. A little bit of free advertising, I'm sorry. What's the next question?
Grazie. Chiedo intanto se c'è qualche domanda dal pubblico. Io ne ho un'altra per il web, che arriva dal web. Se si avvicina un microfono qui, se c'è, poi casomai io faccio quell'altra. Intanto cominciamo da qui.
Grazie, buonasera. Niente, io volevo sottolineare il punto che lei ha trattato, è un po' sorvolato, no? È la ridistribuzione del reddito. Non so, in Italia e nei paesi occidentali la concentrazione del reddito su pochissime persone secondo me è la base della crisi che ci sta attanagliando, e credo che se non si faranno politiche, diciamo, adeguate per ridistribuire un reddito e quindi creare più consumi, diciamo una platea più ampia di consumatori, credo che non ne usciremo, credo mai.
Grazie.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree completely. I would add, and we have to generate interesting employment opportunities for the young. It's the only amendment I would make to your. I'm glad you made the point.
Un'altra domanda? Mi abbiamo qui davanti, grazie. Signora con la camicia azzurra, se non sbaglio. Sì.
The man in the blue shirt. Cool.
I think one of the most important things you said before is just the value-added concept. I think it's a key concept for wealth creation. So I would like if you better explain at this point how you calculate, what do you mean with value-added concept?
Okay. So basically, so at the industry level, let's take an industry. You ask yourself, you know, what is it doing for society? And the answer is, at least the answer economists give is, well, it takes inputs like energy, like agricultural raw materials, depends on the industry, like if it's aluminum smelting, it would be bauxite, dug out of the ground probably in Australia by somebody, and combines it with labor and capital and sometimes, you know, really innovative technology, and produces an output. And the difference between what it takes in and what it puts out is the value added. And that value added gets distributed to the people who work there in various categories, to the owners of the capital that was committed to the enterprise, and to the government in the form of taxes. Then if you think of this in terms of growth and income distribution and stuff like that, value added per person isn't exactly the same as income, but you can't distribute. You know, if the government takes a certain amount, and if the required return on capital is whatever it is, and so they take a certain amount, what's left over for labor is the value added, you know, that's available. And so incomes, on average, can't get much out of line with the value added that's contributed per person employed. If you're sitting in China, what you're saying is if we got rising incomes, then we have to have an industrial structure and a set of productivity levels that create value added per person employed that's consistent with those income levels. So it's a chicken and egg problem. The income levels go up and it forces the structural change and you get higher value added per person, and then the incomes go up again and that forces more structural change. And if you're really smart, you keep appreciating the currency because it keeps the pressure on. And you certainly don't devalue, you know, because that takes the pressure off. Remember Italy in the, you know, period prior to the euro, you know, periodic devaluation. So one of the reasons you have a little bit more structural adjustment here is you took the pressure off, you know, with the devaluations. The developing countries know that sometimes you have to devalue to reset, like Greece does, in order to sort of restart the engine. But they also know that devaluing is not a growth strategy. Why? Well, because when you devalue, you make everybody poorer, basically, because everything that you buy from outside is more expensive. You make yourself more competitive, but you simultaneously make yourself poorer. And by the way, if you have external debt, you wouldn't dare devalue, okay? So that's been done many, many times before, including most recently by the Eastern European countries and citizens who borrowed for mortgages, to buy houses in euros and Swiss francs, and then their currencies collapsed. That's a disaster. I mean, if you borrow 100 euros, and then all of a sudden your currency is worth half what it was, then basically what you have to pay back feels to you like 200 euros. That's called in international finance the original sin, and you don't do it. And so that's why we talk about value added, because it's basically, another word would be productivity, properly thought about, but not just in macro terms, but that's why we talk so much about it, because it's got to sort of keep in line with income. If you get in a Greek situation, what you basically got is relatively low productivity and relatively low value added per person that's inconsistent with the income levels. And that's what has to be reset. Now, if you could go to everybody and say, well, look, I'm sorry, but we have to lower all your incomes by 40%, there'll be a riot. But if you say, I'm sorry, our currency's overvalued, it's going down by 40%, everybody says, oh, gee, that's okay. Well, it turns out it's the same thing. Almost. So it's a much nicer way to get it done. I'm not saying, this, exiting from the Eurozone is an unknown path, so I don't overinterpret it. But that's why we focus on value added. It's understanding the drivers of productivity and value added as an economy grows structurally. That's the core of understanding high growth developing economy. It's what I learned from that exercise, basically.
C'è qui davanti un'altra domanda.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Yeah, in English is fine.
I don't need it.
All right. Well, I have seen that you have showed us a quite good scenario for Italy in this moment, and I've been glad to hear that. However, I see a lot of people who don't have enough trust and whose expectations are very low on the future, and they see a dark future. So my question at the moment is, what do you think is the role of expectations and of people's trust in this particular time, in this particular historical period in Italy and in the Eurozone and in the world in general?
Trust is very important, as is the feeling that we're all in this together, and if it's a bit of a mess, we all have to pay something to get out of it. And it's what I meant when I tried to focus on the distributional problems. Now, if you try that in an entity that has no national sense of unity, sense of being in it together. Let me give you an example you weren't thinking about. But why did Africa have such trouble for the first 40 years after World War II, and now is a pretty high growth place with a pretty bright looking future for the most part? Not every country, there's 50 of them, but it's 1 billion people and it's looking pretty smart. And into the crisis, they were growing at 6% a year, not bad. Why did they have so much trouble? Because the colonial empires collapsed, and they created these countries that were sort of nonsensical. One was, landlocked. Most of them had a bunch of tribes or something like that, and sometimes significant diversity in terms of religious background. But there wasn't anything that made people think that they were part of a country, that they were fellow citizens. And so a good chunk of that 40 years was spent building a sense of national identity. And it's very hard to quantify, but it's crucial. Why is Europe floundering? Because Europeans don't yet, consider themselves citizens of Europe. And so they won't transfer stuff across boundaries when they should. You can't run a unit in the end where if you tried to run the United States and you said you never can transfer resources from California to Arizona or Ohio, no matter how much trouble Ohio's in, you can't run the country. All you got is a bunch of separate states. And Europe has to get there. But it takes time, and you have to build intergenerationally. It takes several generations, this sense of belonging to some unit. And that's at least overlaps with the notion of trust. The other thing you have to do is trust government. You know, that they're not going to steal the stuff, that they're reasonably capable of responding and being fair. It doesn't even have to be a democratic government. I mean, people puzzle as to why China performs reasonably well. And the answer is because, by and large, the government's sort of on the people's side, as perceived by the people, since the Communist Revolution. Now, they're starting to lose that perception. And most people, including me, are betting that in an unknown form, as the country gets richer, it'll become more democratic and acquire the legitimacy that goes with that. But none of us knows how, or with what path, and how bumpy it'll be, or a bunch of things. But that when Wen Jiabao starts talking about political form and local democracy recently, on his way out, he's the premier, the second. That's what he's talking about. So it's just crucially important. It's kind of frustratingly hard to quantify for economists who like to quantify everything, but it's, the other thing that's important is leadership, right? I mean, yeah, you can see it everywhere. I mean, you get real leadership that's willing to kind of explain things, build consensus, recognizing it has to be fair and stuff like that. You see it in the early stage developing countries. You see it all around us every day. It's just crucial. There's a gentleman back there. Right back behind you.
Yes, sì, Mr. Spence, come lei sa siamo in diretta via web e quindi abbiamo il pubblico che ci sta seguendo in internet, in streaming sul sito www.segnavie.it. Approfitto per ringraziare Enrico e Roberto che stanno seguendo la diretta via Facebook e Twitter. Immagino che ci sarà molto movimento ed è arrivata una domanda dal pubblico via internet e quindi diamo spazio anche a chi ci segue da casa. La domanda è questa: non è pericoloso che i mercati giudichino e scelgano la guida politica di un paese? Ci arriva da Pietro, che ringraziamo.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a terrible idea. There's a perception that the markets are in control that I think, you know, is in some sense understandable, but is too simple. The way the markets get in control is when the government's out of control. And so the markets aren't in control in China, and they're not in control in Germany for the most part, especially the financial markets. But they are, you know, in danger of being in control in America, and they are very influential in Southern Europe, including here. So I think the way to think about it is, basically, this is a competitive world. It's a competitive world for goods and services. If you want to have businesses here as opposed to somewhere else, it's got to be the right place for them, with the right human capital, the right regulatory environment. If you want to have capital, financial capital here, there's got to be a reason it gets here. And if you have a government that thinks it has a right to capital, you know, with an unknown credit quality underneath it, then it's just made a mistake, right? I mean, people are allocating capital, you know, based on return and risk. And it's just amazing to me that a significant chunk of the advanced countries turned what used to be thought of as a risk-free asset into an asset that has risk associated with credit quality, including the United States, which lost its AAA rating about a year ago, a little less. And that was after the fiasco over the national debt ceiling. Can you imagine not raising the national debt ceiling and having a technical default on United States treasuries? I mean, that's unbelievable. Well, we almost did it. Why? your analysis of the political system is as good as mine. So all I really want to say is this notion that the financial markets are in control and there's something gone wrong isn't entirely wrong, but you don't want to shoot the messenger. Because the messenger is basically telling you what anybody would tell you. If you have a business that needs money and doesn't look like it will ever pay it back, you won't find a lender. And that's not the lender's fault. Okay? So the corner we need to turn here in Italy and in Southern Europe and in Europe generally, is we've got to get to the point where the markets believe that given the yields, the risks have gone down enough because the reform process is working and the center's committed to making it happen and holding the Eurozone together, then the crisis will be over. Then the money will start flowing back. And that's not, I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with that process. Other ones?
So che c'era qualcuno in fondo? No, ecco qua, grazie.
Professore, lei sa che la crisi del 2008 è stata eminentemente finanziaria, i prodotti derivati e così via. La mia domanda è, secondo lei sono stati presi tutti i provvedimenti necessari perché ciò non si verifichi, oppure c'è il pericolo che succeda ancora una crisi del genere e magari peggiore? Grazie.
It's a very good question. The crisis was a financial crisis. There are various diagnoses of that, but they all have common elements, so we don't need to kind of detain ourselves. There was a whole lot of risk in the system, enough so it became systemic. It wasn't recognized by economists, who deserve to be humble. It wasn't recognized by the regulators, and interestingly, it wasn't recognized by a very large number of the market participants. So all the defense mechanisms failed. The private sector's people, you know what I'm talking about. If this was, a game where the sophisticated investors, kind of beat out the fools and sold them rubbish, then you wouldn't have every major bank and investment bank's balance sheet nearly crushed because they were holding the same stuff, okay? The only people who weren't holding it, by the way, were the developing countries, not us. We don't understand that stuff. So the answer is, so I think one way to think about the answer to the question is, do we now understand all the dimensions of systemic risk that we didn't understand before that allowed this thing to build up and then eventually crash? And I think the answer to that is we're making progress, but we don't. We don't yet, I think, really understand the things that cause the whole financial system to become periodically systemically risky, what the underlying dynamics and structural elements of that are. But a lot of smart people are working on it. And for those of you who are here 30 or 40 years from now, probably one of them will be a person who's young now who received the Nobel Prize because they figured it out. Because nothing's more important, I would imagine, than getting this right. We are making progress. That people are starting to understand it better. George Soros has funded a whole lot of different young people doing research in various aspects of this, unconventional ideas. The regulators are putting very strict limits, maybe even at times too strict on leverage, because we know leverage is a core piece of this. Even people like Mohamed El-Arian and I are writing about multiple equilibria and whether that helps you understand some of the systemic risk in the structures. But the job's not done. So we're doing the best we can with it, I think. Global coordination, probably not a very high grade. Better than global coordination in general. Somebody sent me a bunch of questions that all of you wanted answers to. There's 2 pages of them here. One of them had to do with the G20. The G20 did great in a crisis. It's doing fairly poorly now on global coordination. But the central bankers talk to each other. And so there's some progress, yeah. But job not done.
Direi che siamo quasi in chiusura, forse un'ultimissima domanda se è breve, ce l'abbiamo qui davanti e poi ci salutiamo.
Buonasera. Mi ha colpito molto l'analisi che ha presentato riguardo ai posti di lavoro e al plus valore che si genera con lavori commerciali e quelli che dipendono invece dallo Stato, la sanità, protetti. Mi sembra di capire che la chiave, mi riferisco soprattutto all'Italia, potrebbe essere quella di tornare un paese trainante con l'industria. Mi sembra quello il settore che genera più plus valore anche negli ultimi anni. I paesi in via di sviluppo e per rimanere all'Europa, non so, la Polonia nel 2009 è stato l'unico paese ad aumentare il PIL perché è un paese che si è dato negli ultimi 15-20 anni, ha mantenuto una certa industria pesante e produce molti manufatti, semilavorati e prodotti beni di consumo. Cosa si può fare in concreto secondo lei per tornare per ridiventare un paese come lo eravamo negli anni 50-60, trainante per non so, per esempio stimolare i brevetti, sicuramente non drogare la domanda, per esempio con gli incentivi per l'acquisto di automobili, per esempio, quello sicuramente non serve a niente.
Grazie, e questa è l'ultima domanda.
I don't think you said go back, but then you said in one dimension. You can't really go back, okay? Because or if you do, the cost will be enormous because the rest of the world has changed around you. What you can do is, what I would do here, and it's obviously made more difficult by a constrained fiscal situation, is I would make sure that the growth part of the reform agenda has heavy investment in, education, research, a whole bunch of institutions that are focused on skills and skills upgrading and whatnot. I would make the unemployment system be a skills training system as it is in Germany and a number of other countries is about to become in Sweden. These are countries that have conducted important experiments, and so they basically said unemployment isn't just social insurance, it's a transition, and the society is fully behind making the transition. And I honestly don't think you can solve it by shifting around the demand. Maybe you can. One of the questions that was asked in this long list is, could we have an outbreak of protectionism? Sure we could. If we can't solve the employment problem, it's very easy to see on multiple countries, running from Spain all the way through to the United States, that people, would get fed up and express themselves through the democratic system. And an outbreak of protectionism, most people agree, will eventually cost everybody a whole lot. And we've tried that experiment before, globally, including, in the Great Depression, with the United States in the lead. We thought, well, we'll isolate ourselves from that. Put up a whole bunch of tariffs, called the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, and that wasn't a very good idea. So I think what we do is, if we've lost some of our innovative capacity or some of the edge on our human capital generating mechanism, we can get that back. If our educational system has slipped in certain dimensions in terms of quality, fairly widespread problem, we can fix that. It's hard, but we can fix it. But I think what we can't do, in the end, if you don't want to pay an astronomically high price for the employment that you're creating, then you basically have to work. You have to work with the global economy. If you look at the developing countries, the ones that isolated themselves from the global economy are the ones that don't grow. Only they're at, $400 per capita income. It's sort of sad, and there are a few left that are doing that, isolated in one way or another. So I think that's the kind of direction that we're going. But to be honest with you, in addition, we may, given the kind of global forces at work, we may also have to be more aggressive in redistributing income than we were, a point made over here. a few minutes ago, and a lot of other instruments. I mean, I don't know anybody who thinks they know the whole answer to this in any country. But we can get on with it, try to do the best we can.
Grazie. Thank you very much.